Okay, good evening everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I know many of you in the audience, but some I don't. My name is Jenny Hyam, I'm the principal here at St George's, and it's a real privilege to be here this evening, as I'm sure many in the audience share that sentiment. It's such an exciting, buzzing atmosphere. Hannah keeps telling me it doesn't feel real, but I can assure you it is. I think I'm not surprised that one feels a little bit nervous before an inaugural, because I think it's quite a difficult gig. You know, you're used to speaking in various contexts, but with your inaugural, you've got to span serious science, serious friendship, serious life journey. And I have no doubt that both our speakers are going to be great communicators, because I have to say, both of you individually, I really enjoy our conversations. So today it's about neurology. You might think that as a gynaecologist that was always slightly intimidating above the neck, but I have no doubt that you will be entertaining and informative in what you tell us. The other great thing about inaugurals is the opportunity for many old friends to meet, and also for your parents and family to be extraordinarily proud of you. We've got two lectures today. I don't want either speaker to feel under time pressure to complete within the time, but to add to the fact, we're also going to invite no questions at all. So if you have questions, you can have those over a drink when it's all finished. So first of all, Hannah, you're a wonderful asset to St George's. Your vibrancy and colour was something that I noticed very early after my arrival. You are a consummate academic, superb teacher, researcher, and also somebody who has allowed her personality to very positively influence what you do for us. So you described yourself before as part of the George's family, and I think we're going to hear more of that now, and of your own family. So thank you so much.
So thank you, Jenny. I'm obviously not feeling any pressure at all after that introduction. So I think it's best I just get on with it. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the background to the title of this lecture, and in doing so a minuscule amount about my sort of early development. And then mainly I'm going to talk about exceptional seizures, an exceptional boy, and lessons learnt along the way. So this is my mum. It's the only baby photo of me I'm going to show, who was an artist and designer. She's not well enough to be here. This is being recorded for her. And she was a later turned educator. So she started an artist, became an educator. And this is my dad, Alan, who was a zoologist and geneticist, who alongside his university and academic roles, research roles, spent much of his life collating an archive of papers about the biologist William Bateson. Now, Bateson was an English biologist who was the first person to use the term genetics to describe the study of heredity. And in the decades following Darwin and Mendel, he was the person who really conceptualized the biological basis of evolution. And Dad saw him as an unsung hero who needed proper recognition. Dad was also a big influence on my early exposure to science, pickled chickens and things in his lab. And I borrowed the title of his book for this lecture. So I think I probably always had an academic bent. I was definitely a girly swat at school. I looked back and I think this is my first proper research project, which I did for my A-level on mould and crossing over, genetics influence there. And I remember really enjoying the attention to detail, the sort of obsessionality of it, the rigour, but also the opportunity to be creative and to make something new, perhaps from my artistic half of the family. In terms of why neurology, well, for me, that's always been obvious. The brain is the source of everything that we see, do, experience, live. So it's obviously more interesting than anything else. And I always felt that, and was also influenced by the writings of the very brilliant Oliver Sacks, who I highly commend to anyone who hasn't read his work. So my next experience of research was halfway through my clinical training when I did an integrated BSc in physiology, and again I found it weirdly satisfying to sit in a dark room with slices of dogfish retina and hand-pulled microelectrodes trying to get these perfect traces to prove some small piece of what was felt to be important science at the time. So I was always very keen to get back into the lab as a result of that. So fast forward a few years, I'd finished my main clinical training and was still hooked on neurology, didn't really know which area of neurology was going to grab me, but I really wanted to get back into the lab. And I was offered the opportunity to do this project on mitochondrial diseases, which often affect the nervous system, and mainly it attracted me because I could see it was going to give me a very broad range of laboratory skills that I might then be able to use elsewhere further down the line. So I spent 2 years at the Royal Free with fantastic teaching from Mark Cooper, a biochemist, and Tony Shapira, who is a professor of neurology there, and really had a great time, but also knew by the end of that this wasn't for me. Now, mitochondria are the battery packs of our cells. They're essential to cell survival and functioning, but mitochondrial disorders are mostly rare, often life-limiting or indeed fatal, with very few, even now, effective treatments. And it just didn't grab me. I didn't want to be Miss Mitochondria. So before I come on to explain how I turned into an epilepsy specialist from that background, I thought for the non-medical people in the audience, which there's a frightening number, it's very strange speaking to friends and family, I thought I'd just go through a few definitions. So a seizure is the clinical manifestation of a burst of electricity in the brain, of abnormal electrical activity. And any brain can have a seizure if you upset it enough. So alcohol withdrawal seizures, or seizures at the time of a bang on the head. Those are sort of provoked seizures. The difference in epilepsy is that there's a disease of the brain that gives you an enduring predisposition to unprovoked seizures. So seizures that can happen at any time, repeatedly, sometimes for the life of the individual. Now, both seizures and epilepsy come in lots of different causes, and there's lots of different types. So how a seizure presents will depend on how far the discharge spreads in the brain. Most people are familiar with what used to be called the grand mal seizure or the tonic-clonic seizure, where the patient loses consciousness, falls to the ground and has jerking of all four limbs and then is confused for a period of time afterwards. But that's only one type of seizure. There are hundreds. So a small seizure in the brain might just manifest as a sudden, unexpected burst of laughter. Or it might manifest as a sudden intense feeling of fear or anxiety. It might give you tingling spreading up your arm, or jerking or stiffness of the arm within full consciousness. The discharge spreads a little bit further. You may lose awareness and not remember what's happening, but still look as though you're conscious to other people. So you might look confused or behave in a sort of blank, odd way, and sometimes that can involve quite complex movements, so people picking at their clothes or fiddling or becoming very agitated for the time that seizure is lasting. And then it's only if the seizure discharge spreads further or involves both sides of the brain from the very beginning that you fall to the ground and have a convulsion. So there's infinite variety in seizures. It captures everything that the brain can do, which I found interesting. It's common. So 1 in 20 people will have a seizure during their lifetime. Almost 1 in 100 people in the UK have epilepsy. There's probably over 100 people in this room. I won't ask you to name yourself if you're that person. But it's a common condition, and importantly, the right treatment and management can make a massive difference to the outcome. But there is still a treatment gap. There's a bunch of patients for whom we don't have effective treatments and we don't know how to manage them. So it was obviously very interesting to me. Now, most seizures stop on their own. The discharge lasts only a few seconds or a few minutes. The patient might be a bit confused or groggy for a period of time afterwards, but the seizure itself is quite short. The exceptional seizure, hence the title of the lecture, is status epilepticus. So these are seizures which don't stop on their own with recovery to baseline, but where the patient just carries on fitting, sometimes for hours, days, weeks or longer. We also know that status epilepticus, certainly the more severe types, convulsive status epilepticus in particular, is bad for the brain. It's associated with a risk of long-term permanent damage to the brain. So even if the seizure is stopped further down the line, the brain may be left with permanent changes to the cells and the networks, manifesting as problems with memory or thinking or balance. And also status of itself can cause epilepsy. It can change the circuitry in the brain, and that person then is at risk of recurrent unprovoked seizures, and sometimes it can be fatal. So there I was at the end of my clinical training, back on the wards, and I was seeing about one patient a week probably with convulsive status. That's about the average in a big teaching hospital. And I was interested in epilepsy. It just struck me as much more interesting. So the first thing I did, before I come on to that, status is a medical emergency, and we knew at the time that I was doing my clinical training that there were sort of standard protocols of care, so basic first aid, and then the priority is to stop the seizures. And there was a whole sequence of drugs that we used, which I won't go through in detail, to try and stop the seizures, a sort of escalating protocol. But at least one of those drugs, phenytoin, was really very old. This was the decade of the brain, supposedly, the 1990s, and it just struck me as odd that we were using such an old-fashioned drug. And then when I learnt about the drug, it was even more odd, because this is a drug that takes 30 minutes to infuse in a patient who's fitting, where the priority is stopping the seizures. And it often causes drops in blood pressure, and it often causes problems with the heart rate. It's not a nice drug, and it just struck me as a rather odd thing to be doing in this era of the decade of the brain. And there were a lot of other new developments for epilepsy, but not for status. And then this trial came out, which at the time was the biggest one that had ever been done. And if anything, I won't go through it in detail, but phenytoin on the right here looked like the worst drug of the things that were available at that time. But it was still the drug in all the protocols, and actually it still is. Internationally, it's still the most commonly used drug for status epilepticus. So that grabbed me as in terms of something that was interesting to look at further. So I say I'm back on the ward, seeing all these patients. So the first step of my transition into epilepsy was to do my own little clinical study in Status Epilepticus, which was later published with Tony Shapira. Now at that point my post rotated to the National Hospital of Neurology, where I met two people who were in the audience. So Simon Chauvan, who was head of the epilepsy group, indeed head of the Department of Neurology there, and who was the internationally renowned Mr. Status Epilepticus, Professor Status Epilepticus. He really was a huge figure in that area. And then Matthew, pictured in my hot tub, or outdoor hydrotherapy pool, as we like to call it. Matthew, at that time, was another budding academic neurologist in training who was doing a postdoctoral work on this electrical stimulation model of status epilepticus. So Matthew and Simon became what I like to think of as my epilepsy parents. Now, I know that Matthew wants me to point out that we're about the same age and he can't possibly be my father, but that's how I think of them. So we knew then, and it's still known now, that one of the ways to study epilepsy and one of the causes of epilepsy is you can take a perfectly healthy, normal brain, do something to it, give it an insult, by which I don't mean shouting abuse or swearing at it, but insults like a traumatic brain injury or a stroke or a rampant bacterial meningitis. And when the individual's recovered from that insult, they may now have epilepsy. It causes some damage to the brain and causes this sort of epilepsy. And Matthew's model, the insult was status epilepticus itself induced by electrical stimulation of discrete brain areas. So this was a model in which you could really study the mechanisms of status, the consequences of status, and try and develop new treatments for status epilepticus, and in doing so potentially also new treatments that might reduce the risk of the long-term consequences, the memory and cognitive problems and the development of epilepsy. Now, handily, around the same time, given that I was someone with no experience in epilepsy, but a lot of experience in mitochondria, around the same time there was a lot of interest in the role of mitochondria in brain damage and in neuronal cell death. But it had been very little studied in epilepsy. So I had some additional training from Matthew on experimental epilepsy, clinical training from Simon, and returned to the lab to look at the role of mitochondria in seizure-associated brain damage. And I'll say huge thanks to Matthew and Simon at this point, whose mentorship and sharing their knowledge with me and ongoing friendship has been, truly wonderful, and I wouldn't be here today without them. So over the next few years, we did a whole range of experiments trying to unpick the metabolic consequences in the brain following seizures and trying to work out which of those might be important. And we did identify a key sequence of metabolic changes associated with cell death. We also found a new method for detecting a marker of biological damage, 3-nitrotyrosine in biological tissues, and we set about exploring how we could manipulate those with a range of compounds to try and prevent these consequences. Again, I need to thank both the funders, the Wellcome Trust Advanced Fellowship, a number of other grants that I received, and also the team who did this with me. Again, Karen's here, I know, the most fantastic postdoctoral scientist, and also other research students and research assistants and postdoctoral fellows, some of whom moved with me when I came here in 2003 in the middle of all this, to take up the post here. So this was, again, it was a very exciting area at the time. There was lots of groups around the world looking at what happened to brains after seizures, applying all these lovely new techniques that we'd got in the decade of the brain and trying to work it out. And lots of things were going on, but it quite quickly became clear that many of these changes in the brain, including some of the mitochondrial changes, might well be damaging, but they were also fundamental to normal functioning and to repair and compensation. So trying to sort out which of these things is bad and we need to try and stop it without causing adverse effects and upsetting normal function was becoming increasingly difficult. Several papers and a few book chapters later, then something else happened. And at this point, I'm going to give my voice a break and let you read for some slides and listen to some music. So Alfie also taught me a lot about epilepsy. Now, to be fair, exceptional though he was, he did this alongside many exceptional patients. Again, one or two of them are here today, some of whom have truly humbling stories and amazing endurance, from whom I learnt a lot. And some of these patients I've looked after for 15 or almost 20 years now in some instance, and it's been a privilege to share those journeys. So one of the things I learnt, it's kind of obvious, but if you have a chronic neurodisability or a chronic condition or a life-limiting condition, then having a serious condition, life-threatening condition, having access to healthcare professionals in whose expertise you have complete faith and who you can get hold of when you need them is absolutely invaluable. Now, Alfie had an army of such professionals. Again, some of them are here, and Martin and I are truly grateful to each and every one of you, too many to name. One of the other things I learnt by experience is that one of the biggest challenges of epilepsy is its inherent variability, the fact that it's so unpredictable. So for a patient or a carer looking after someone with epilepsy, the next seizure can happen at any time, completely out of the blue, without any obvious trigger. And add to that the uncertainty of not knowing whether the next treatment that you try is actually going to make any difference or not, or perhaps make things worse. And whether, when you go into a bad spell, is this going to be a bad spell for a few days or a few months or weeks or long, how long, you just don't know. And if you add to that the uncertainty of not knowing how other people are going to respond to your condition, because epilepsy is still enormously misunderstood and prejudiced and stigmatised, all of that makes a huge burden for this disease. Now, one of the sort of human tendencies, maybe more for scientists than others, but I think generally with something that's unpredictable or happens unexpectedly, we have an innate human want to try and understand it, to look for cause and effect, to try and see why that seizure happened that day as opposed to any other day, or why things are worse at the moment when so you try and look for cause and effect. And with that comes the risk of misattribution. So I found one of the things you can do in this situation is document what's going on. And if you don't do that, then this risk of misattribution is quite high. And what I mean by that is that if you're in a bad spell and you start a new drug and then things get better, you think, oh great, the new drug's obviously worked. But then things get worse again. And you think, oh, well there must be something else going on, or the drug has worn off. Very often, if you stand back and look at the bigger picture, you realise what you've experienced is just the inherent variability of epilepsy, and the drug hasn't done anything at all. Now, you can only see that if you make sort of contemporaneous records, and I found myself, as I often asked patients to do, obsessively charting his every seizure and every sort of little thing that was happening here in an attempt to try and understand why he was getting better or why he was in a bad spell, and plotting them onto Excel. People who know me know I love Excel spreadsheets, and creating graphs to try and prove this cause and effect. And sometimes that was really helpful. There were also times when I thought something was helping, and then I looked back at the charts that I'd done at the time, and I could see that that was just the triumph of hope over reality. Now, nowadays, seizure diaries are still a mainstay of epilepsy care. They long have been. It's something we ask people to do. But there are lots of nice new apps and trendy ways of monitoring seizures. And one of those apps is something called Seizure Tracker. It's in the States. And this has been running for a long time. It's developed by patients. And there's now data from over 1 million seizures from real-world patients, if you like, tracked over years, hundreds of thousands of patients tracked over years. And a group in the States have analysed this data, and it's confirmed what we always thought. Epilepsy is inherently variable and unpredictable. You can't put any equation onto it. Now, that's a challenge not only for the patient, but actually it's also a challenge for clinical trial design. And I'm not going to go into the details, but the same group have analysed this data and done some trial simulations and basically demonstrated that most, if not all, of the epilepsy trials that we've done in the last 10 or 15 years have failed to properly account for this inherent variability. And if you add to that the fact that clinical trials by definition tend to have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, so the patients who can go into trials are only a tiny subset of the rest of the world with epilepsy. So what all of that means is that this is a massive challenge for the clinician. because it means that a lot of the data on which we make our treatment decisions is actually rather questionable, certainly when it comes to effectiveness into controlling seizures. Now, that's not to say that the explosion in new anti-epileptic drugs in the last 20 years hasn't been in advance, because it has. Many of the newer drugs are much better tolerated, have fewer drug interactions, and they also actually give you options, they give you choices. And another thing I learned through Alfie and through my conversations with other patients is actually having choices of itself is really important. It gives you a sense of control and ownership over your condition, which you might not otherwise have. And it also offers hope, the value of which is not to be underestimated if you're living with a lifelong chronic condition such as epilepsy. But what that means in terms of my clinical practice when I see patients is that every time I try a new treatment, or I say to a patient, why don't you try adding this drug in, really I'm doing a clinical trial on one person. I don't know if that drug is going to work or not. Keep the system on. So how has that influenced my personal practice? Well, despite what I've said about counting seizures and sort of unreliability of it, the goal of epilepsy treatment remains to get people seizure-free and to do that with the minimum side effects. That's what the NICE guidelines say. That's what we should aim for. We should individualise treatment, choose the drug that's most likely to achieve seizure freedom without side effects. And in about 70% of patients we can achieve that potentially, so that's a pretty good result. And we know that being seizure-free massively correlates with quality of life. But in this other group, the patients who aren't seizure-free, we also know that whether you're having one seizure a day, or one a week, or one a month, or two a year, actually correlates very poorly with quality of life. That's not the big determinant in how someone is living with their epilepsy. So one consequence from that, I think, is that maybe counting seizures in this drug refractory group isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all or the right thing to do. And for me, I think individualised treatment in this group is as much about individualised goals, about discussing with that patient what matters to them and what they might like to achieve. And sometimes counting seizures is the right thing to do, but sometimes that's not the answer. Actually, you need to look on a positive. You need to say, well, let's look at seizure-free days rather than whether you have 2 seizures a day or 5 seizures a day some days. Or something much more nebulous, like, well, tell me how many good days you've had this month. Do it with happy faces and sad faces. With Alfie, we ended up kind of really measuring quality ALF, which was a rather nebulous thing, but that's what mattered, actually. The seizure counts didn't. And sometimes it's nothing to do with seizures at all. So in this group, who are not seizure-free especially, we know that the things that correlate best with quality of life aren't the numbers of seizures. It's things like, are you depressed? Do you have an anxiety disorder? How worried are you about your next seizure? Are you getting side effects from your drugs? Are there other mood or behaviour problems that are causing it? And epilepsy drugs have effects on bone health as well and the risk of fractures. So lots of other things that aren't seizure related might actually be the things that we need to focus on in terms of managing this group. In the context of learning disability, about 40% of patients with learning disability have epilepsy. So 1 in 100 in the general population, but about 40% in learning disability. Now, most doctors looking after patients with chronic conditions are pretty used to asking them about their occupation and about their hobbies, because we want to try and understand how this condition is impacting on your life to help you live with it. But in someone with learning disability, it's very easy to overlook that. And I felt actually in that group it's even more important to really understand how the condition is impacting on day-to-day life. And in someone who's non-verbal or severely disabled, it's just as important. It was just as important to me that Alfie's doctors knew that he liked swimming, that he could smile, that he could laugh, that he knew who we were. That was just as important as them looking at his seizure diaries. So I think I now try even harder to really get underneath the epilepsy and the disability and understand the person inside. When I look back at the clinical practice as well as my own personal practice, if I look at the service developments I've been involved with in the last sort of however many years it is here now at George's, together with Tim, who amazingly has flown over from Austria, I can't believe it, and Marco more recently, and others in the epilepsy group, I'm not going to read these out, but I think when you look at these, I think you can see that they reflect the themes of improving access to the right healthcare professional at the right time, of making sure people have got choice and options, and also an enhanced focus on the consequences and the comorbidities of epilepsy rather than just on seizure counts themselves. So back to status. I didn't give up on status. So by 2000, shortly before I moved here, there were some other drugs around for status epilepticus that were now available as intravenous agents, and which, even just on the basis of how quickly you could give them, looked potentially more interesting than phenytoin as an effective treatment for status epilepticus. So I started thinking about a trial in status in around 2003, so a long time ago now. Now, status, like many conditions, is best advanced if you bring together lots of different brains with different expertise, not just a bunch of neurologists siloed in their own little world. And for status epilepticus, that was really delivered in practice through the vision of Simon Chauven again, and another colleague from Austria, Eugen Trinker, who held the first international status epilepticus colloquium here in London in 2007. Now, Alfie was about 6-7 months old at that colloquium, and I was invited to speak. They didn't let me off the hook. So I turned up, delivered my talk. I had a breast pump in my handbag. I asked for fridge space for the milk, which came as a bit of a surprise to the caterers. But it obviously didn't put them off, because they invited me back another year. So in 2009, I was invited back to lead a clinical trials workshop, because they knew I was interested in developing this, to try and start the work to really put together what we hoped would be the definitive clinical trial in the management of status epilepticus. And to cut a long story short, after a lot of many years and a lot of hurdles along the way, the trial was finally launched in 2014 with a grant of just over $20 million from the NIH in the States. And this trial is currently running in 74 USA sites, taking advantage of established research networks that are there. I'm working with this amazing team of experts around the world, and we're recruiting ahead of target, under budget, and with exceptional timing. Just this weekend, we had a sort of blinded set of interim analysis data sent to us, which we're now pouring through to see what it might mean for the future, but I can't tell you the answer. So you might think that research and clinical practice under a disabled child is more than enough to keep a girl busy. So the obvious question is, well, why education as well? Well, the honest truth is, partly selfish reasons. There's an immediate reward, which I hope to feel shortly, from a lecture which has gone well and that you know people have enjoyed and engaged with. It's also amazing when medical students come back years later as neurology trainees or, God forbid, consultants. It's beginning to happen. And you get the feeling that you had sparked some of that interest in neurology and research or education. It's incredibly gratifying. I also think education is truly inseparable from good clinical practice. When I start a patient on a new drug or recommend a new drug to a patient, if I haven't also explained to them the pros and cons, the benefits and risks of that drug clearly, and made sure they understand the need to take it regularly, well, I really haven't done my job properly. And teaching forces you to explain things, to practice how you explain things. So feedback from students and peers along the way has shaped my clinical practice in that way. Another great thing about being involved in education is that you get to meet a whole bunch of other professionals in other disciplines, both in and outside medicine, who you might never otherwise have encountered. So it really broadens your perspective and your horizon. And particularly here at George's, I've met some amazing people who've really influenced me. The one who stands out and who I will mention by name is Jill McGawley, who sadly also died last year. Now, Jill was a psychiatrist who I wouldn't otherwise have met but through education, but she and I ran the so-called life control module, which is the neurology psychiatry module here, for over 10 years. And co-teaching with Jill over that time basically gave me a kind of backdoor, up-to-date training in some psychiatry. It broadened my understanding of the mind hugely, and also on attitudes to hidden disability, for which I'll be forever grateful. And I'm also very pleased her husband's here with us tonight. outside of George's, education also opens up all sorts of other doors. So for the last 6 years now, I think 2011, I've been one of 4 clinical leads on this international not-for-profit e-learning project. Simon Chauvin's also involved, which is covering postgraduate neurology, the whole, and neurosurgery and neuroscience and neuropsychology in an e-learning platform with over 500 modules, webinars, virtual cases. It's free to low-income countries, and it's free to most UK and European neurology and neuroscience trainees, thanks to the support of the UK Joint Neurosciences Council and the European Academy of Neurology, which brings me on to my most recent education challenge. So the EAN, European Academy of Neurology, represents postgraduate neurology trainees and consultants across Europe. So it's got over 25,000 neurologist members, has an annual congress with about 6,000 or 7,000 delegates, and it formed in 2014 following the dissolving and merger of 2 previous societies. And I found myself sort of inadvertently appointed to the board of the European Academy of Neurology, and as the education chair for this organisation, I was responsible for the postgraduate courses and research fellowships and clinical fellowships and regional teaching courses and congress and all sorts of things for this ridiculous population of neurologists across Europe. And I honestly remember very vividly the night before I chaired my first meeting. I have a committee and 2 subcommittees in Vienna, and I had the most dreadful nightmares, which involved a castle dungeon and a load of these committee people just ignoring me and having a sort of banquet, basically. Now, fortunately, through the mentorship and now friendship of my colleagues on the board and the committees, and a sort of crash course in leadership and budgeting and European neuropolitics, including through Brexit, so that's been fascinating. It's been one of the most challenging but also one of the most rewarding things that I've been involved with, and I really want to thank all of my colleagues at the EAN. Now, doing education alongside clinical practice and research for me is also an absolute win-win. People always say, well, you can't do all 3, you're going to have to give one up, and I never wanted to. So involving students, be they research students or medical students, in projects is an absolute win-win. So, and if you look at some of the topics that these students have done over the years, and again I saw at least one turn up there, it's no accident. The astute amongst you might notice that some of these topics map quite closely to the service development slide that I showed earlier on. Now that's not an accident. While the student is beavering away doing their research project for their degree and hopefully getting a publication out of it, I have got a free pair of hands, a willing, fresh pair of energised eyes and brain who bring to life projects I might never have got round to otherwise. And then I'm also getting evidence that I can use to support the business case or the protocol development or the service development. So it's been an enormous joy and also highly productive. So what next? So there's certainly going to be more patients and more students. They just seem to keep coming, whatever you do, and that's obviously a good thing. I hope that I'll continue to be involved in all 3, in research, education and clinical practice, and ultimately the drive is to inform and improve care for our patients. And I think if I've learnt nothing else, it's that knowing what best care looks like is only meaningful if you also bring other people along the journey with you through education. Now there's a few other people I need to thank. They're no less important, there just isn't time. So I want to say thank you to nearly all of my colleagues and staff at the hospital, George's, certainly all the ones who are here, and nearly all of the staff in the medical school as well, and my PA Eleanor, who sadly couldn't be here. But I felt enormously privileged to work here at George's, and through what were some very difficult times for us, both the hospital and the university provided enormous flexibility when I needed it, and a stable source of compassion and friendship and positivity. So thank you to everyone. I've also got some pretty amazing friends and family who were really tested over the last 10 years or so in particular. Some of them have had to put up with me for decades, or indeed my baby brother his whole life. And again, I'm enormously grateful. Thank you for putting up with me and all my rantings and stressors and things. And then perhaps the last person I need to thank is Martin. For 16 years, my partner, of enduring kindness, love, a lot of the cooking, and really, again, just being relentlessly supportive. So thank you, Martin, to the moon and back. Thank you.
I'm Judith, I'm just a colleague of Hannah's from St George's, and I'm going to read from this because I was worried that I'd miss something crucial out. But it's my privilege really to propose thanks to you, Hannah, for your lecture, and of course importantly for your work here with us, your colleagues, your collaborators in the past, your patients as well. So as I knew it would, Hannah's lecture exemplifies for us the scope and depth of her expertise, the originality of her research, and the breadth of her teaching and her clinical work as well. And what I'm going to try and do is layer on top of that the values with which Hannah infuses her work, because it's the kind of how she goes about things that's really very special about her. Now I'm going to do this with 3 visualizations, and the first of you, some of you may not have witnessed if you've not been in Tooting recently, but it usually happens about 6 o'clock, and it's Hannah scooting home, or sometimes down the hospital corridors, on her scooter, determined fashion, fast, accurate, focused, narrowly missing the frail elderly of Tooting and Balham. And that captures for me her energy, focus, capacity and commitment, getting to the journey's end, and also her love of innovation as well. If it's not a scooter, it'll be some new IT toy that she's really enjoying and getting some fun out of. Recently I had to present a complex university case for the university. I really lucked out because Hannah had investigated the case, and that made it a very simple task for me to do. Her attention to detail, her conscientiousness, her fairness, and her skills in reporting made it very, very straightforward. And pretty much everything you produce, from an email to an academic paper, is of that very high scholarly standard. So thank you for that. So on to my next image, and it involves Jill again actually, because I can remember Hannah and Jill together upstairs in, or no, where is it? Yeah, Eddie's, where it used to be, having coffee, and I always assumed they were talking about medical education, but I suspect sometimes it was about designer furniture and jewellery as well. But we'll assume for the purposes of this it was education. We've already seen the kind of deep and broad portfolio of education that Hannah's involved in. But what we haven't heard a bit about is about her public engagement with epilepsy, so the radio phone-ins where patients can phone in, even comments in the Daily Mail, which I kind of hope reported with pink hair maybe, the Daily Mail especially. So all of that engagement that you do as well. And personally I can attest to your teaching, because you tried to teach me about epilepsy medication for some CPD for myself and some rusty colleagues in an evening in your own time, trying to improve our skills in terms of epilepsy. But equally, I know many students who've been enthused by projects with you, and I also know a few students who have greatly benefited from you, but not necessarily realising it at the time when they received your copious feedback on their perhaps less than professional behaviour on your attachment as well. Some delay maybe in their appreciation there. Finally, on to Alfie. I first encountered Alfie at a committee meeting, and I reckon it was probably about 2008. I was very grateful to Alfie for raising the tone of a somewhat dull meeting, I have to say. But what I was also very impressed with was Hannah's ability to both contribute to the meeting as an academic with her academic colleagues, but also care for Alfie at the same time with her clinical colleagues, some of whom are here as well, helping her to care for him within the meeting. Now, professional boundaries are sometimes difficult to achieve when you're a doctor or a healthcare practitioner, but it seems to me that you have managed your multiple identities with many colleagues, and you've been a model of professional behaviour. You seem to recognise when you needed to be a mum, when to be a doctor mum, and when to be a colleague, and navigated those pathways expertly. always advocating for Alfie in the most difficult of circumstances sometimes. With respect to Alfie, I also want to thank you for introducing him to all of us. He's been a real thread and a kind of social thread as well as an educational thread really in all of our interactions with you. And particularly wanted to thank you for hearing all of the solutions that you and Martin found for Alfie's complex problems, for letting Alfie show us a different way to live life to the full, and for sharing with us his achievements and especially his chuckles, the regular videos of the latest development and the latest thing that he'd been enjoying. So finally, just on that note of laughter, I fear I've made Hannah sound rather pious and hard-working, and as all of us here know who know her, know that the last thing she is pious. And going back to thinking about Jill and yourself actually working together, what's missing is that soundtrack of laughter and fun that you had and that you have with many of us when you work. You're always fun, always interesting, always engaging to work with, and work with you is never dull and never onerous. So thank you very much for all of that on behalf of your colleagues here, but also past collaborators and patients as well. Wonderful lecture, and yeah, thanks for being here.